The division of 28 points into four categories is, this is what was announced almost as soon as the 28 points have been leaked out. And I find the whole thing very encouraging, because let's remember that the 28 points included the provision that Ukraine will become a neutral nation, that it will not become a member of any Western military alliance. Not only that, Ukraine would have to enshrine this principle into their constitution. And then the Russian side would have to pass a law saying, we will not go beyond Ukraine. We will not attack any other Western nation, which is extremely important to basically silence all the European warmongers who are screeching, the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming.
The mention of these 28 points is important because it outlines the first real framework for de-escalation. Making Ukraine a neutral, non-aligned state directly addresses Russia's core security concern. In return, Russia issuing a legal guarantee not to strike NATO countries addresses Europe's biggest fear. If both sides committed to this, it would undercut the narrative of inevitable Russian expansion. It doesn't resolve every issue, but it creates a foundation for stability. And for the first time, it shows that a structured path to ending the conflict may actually exist.
Something of the sort can be, very clearly and explicitly formulated. The Russian Duma will pass it into a law. And then, the Americans and the Chinese can say, what are you talking about? The Russians just passed a law. What are you afraid of? So, and then, of course, the European populations will also take note of this fact, and their leaders who are trying to push them into war against Russia will lose not only all credibility, but will probably lose legitimacy, because nobody in Europe voted for war with Russia. Nobody wants war with Russia. It's just a very narrow segment of the political elites who are pushing for this, and who are pushing for it with an increasingly hysterical zeal, a blind zeal, which verges on madness.
If Russia formalizes these guarantees into law, it changes the diplomatic landscape. External powers like the US and China could point to it as a concrete commitment, reducing claims of Russian intent to expand. European publics would also see a clear contradiction between legal guarantees and alarmist rhetoric. That undermines leaders who argue that war is unavoidable. Because the truth is, most Europeans never supported military confrontation with Russia. The push for escalation comes from a small political class, not from the populations they represent.
Minister Johan Wadepoel, can't remember that name, Johan Wadepoel, he went on television and he said that, this was in advance of these talks, if Russia doesn't submit, that then we are going to get directly involved in this war. And if it triggers World War III, so be it for Ukraine. He said something exactly to that effect, which is completely insane. I don't know on whose behalf he's speaking, but he's certainly not speaking on behalf of the German people. And so, the rift between the people, the supposed constituents of European democracies, and their mad leadership is growing wider and wider. And it may be for that reason that, the Americans are anticipating, or maybe even helping, a wave of regime changes in Europe. And they may be, they are doing so by supporting parties like AfD in Germany, by supporting Viktor Orban, Robert Fico, and so forth, all the anti-war leaders. And at the same time, pushing forward the anti-corruption probes, which are already bagging.
Statements like the one attributed to the German foreign minister highlight a major disconnect between leadership rhetoric and public sentiment. Threatening direct intervention or even global conflict does not reflect the views of most Europeans. What we see instead is a widening gap between governments and the populations they represent. This gap is becoming a defining feature of European politics today. It also explains why outside powers may be preparing for political shifts across the continent. Support for anti-war parties suggests that a broader realignment in Europe may already be underway.
I'm convinced that Russia understands perfectly well what they're dealing with and who they're dealing with. The problem is that in the public at large, you have certain public opinions, you have certain conventional wisdoms, and the way people perceive their world. And if you say something that is too radically different from what the average person thinks, the reaction is like, oh my God, these people are completely crazy. So both European leaders, American leaders, Chinese leaders, Russian leaders, they have to be careful to speak in a way that people understand and that they can relate to. Because if they think that Vladimir Putin is completely mad, that he's crazy, then that gives credibility to the other side that says, like, the Russians are coming for us.
The danger in this rhetoric is that it shapes public perception far more than facts do. Even if governments understand the strategic realities, the general population reacts to narratives, not nuance. When leaders speak in extreme or alarmist terms, they reinforce the idea that the opposing side is irrational or unrestrained. That makes diplomatic space smaller and public fear larger. It also empowers those who argue that conflict is inevitable. In this environment, careful and measured communication becomes a strategic necessity.
Even though Vladimir Putin knows what he's dealing with, there's only, he can only go so far in his public statements, but at the same time, the way he expressed himself this time was to discourage European leaders to do anything stupid, and to maybe encourage the people who hear him to exert pressure on their leaders to stop the madness. Because in their special military operation against Ukraine, the Russians are taking the very long view, and they have been very careful not to commit atrocities at large scale. You're going to end up killing some innocent civilians. That's almost unavoidable. But they were very careful not to do that at a large scale or deliberately, or, they made every effort to avoid it where it's avoidable.
Putin's messaging here appears calibrated rather than emotional, aimed at discouraging escalation rather than provoking it. He understands that public statements can either inflame tensions or create room for restraint. By choosing measured language, he signals to European leaders that reckless actions carry consequences. At the same time, he appeals indirectly to European publics, encouraging them to question the direction of their own governments. This fits with Russia's long-term approach to the conflict, which relies on strategic patience rather than shock tactics. Their emphasis on limiting civilian harm, whether fully successful or not, is part of maintaining political legitimacy both domestically and internationally.
Always left an open question, and the how do you call it, the census of the victims and the casualties is not allowed to be completed, because it gives narrative spinners a lot of maneuvering space, right? They can use that story in more effectively. But nevertheless, the atrocities were committed, and to this day, Croatia is still stained by those atrocities. And there are many people on the other side who then fear Croatians. They fear a Croatian state. There are many people around the world who have a certain antipathy towards Croatia for the Nazi-aligned government that we had for a period of time in Zagreb. And so these are, these are the principles of history, and the Russian side recognizes this. So they're very careful not to make such unforced errors in order to be able to build a future with Ukraine as a as a friendly nation on Russia's borders. But if a European nation attacks Russia, umpteenth attack on Russia from the West, well, Russia can cover them in Kinzhals and Oreshniks and Burevestniks and what have you.
Unclear casualty records leave space for narratives to be shaped and contested. This creates long-lasting mistrust between nations and communities. Historical atrocities continue to influence how states view each other today. That is why some actors are cautious to avoid repeating damaging precedents. Their aim is to preserve the possibility of future cooperation after the war, but any direct attack from a European state would trigger a far more severe response.
Hundreds of those missiles have already been programmed with targets at NATO military bases, NATO headquarters, MI6. Who knows? And maybe the Russians will deal very, very harshly with their enemies in Europe, which will be completely different from the way that they have been dealing with Ukraine up until now. It's a very different category of enemy. And so Vladimir Putin just made that known to the Europeans. So, if you want to attack us, you're on your own. It's your own risk, and we will respond the way we see fit. Europeans have no defenses against this. Like if the Russians fire a Kinjal against the NATO military base, the NATO has no way to prevent that impact. And who knows, what targets are already programmed into Russian missiles that will, probably what we've seen in the 12-day war between Iran and Israel will look like a picnic compared to what Europe will receive.
The point being made here is about the scale of escalation that a direct conflict would trigger. Russian strategic planning likely includes pre-selected targets across Europe. A standard practice among major powers. Strikes against NATO infrastructure would be viewed as fundamentally different from operations in Ukraine. Europe's current air and missile defenses are not designed to stop large volumes of hypersonic weapons. This creates a significant deterrent against initiating hostilities. Any confrontation would therefore carry risks far beyond what recent regional conflicts have demonstrated.
That the Trump administration is exerting pressure on them to cooperate. And I think that they're also exerting pressure on them to cooperate with the anti-corruption investigations. And not only that, but people like Yermak, Zelensky, Umerov, and others will know what has been going on behind closed doors in Ukraine, where the influence was coming from, where the money was coming from, where the money was going, how it was laundered, which way. And I think that will inevitably compromise a lot of European leaders and banks and bankers and NGOs and so forth. So we might have like a wholesale purge of this parasitic presence that is not just in Ukraine. It's pretty much everywhere, including the United States, because a couple of weeks ago we found out that a number of European billionaires have been funneling money into the United States to various.
The point being made here is about the scale of escalation that a direct conflict would trigger. Russian strategic planning likely includes pre-selected targets across Europe. A standard practice among major powers. Strikes against NATO infrastructure would be viewed as fundamentally different from operations in Ukraine. Europe's current air and missile defenses are not designed to stop large volumes of hypersonic weapons. This creates a significant deterrent against initiating hostilities. Any confrontation would therefore carry risks far beyond what recent regional conflicts have demonstrated.
Money in question was about 2 billion euros or $2 billion that they funneled to various of these groups in the United States. And that is very, very significant and important to keep an eye on. And I think that discovery that was just by some, private group that was revealed, that's probably just the tip of the iceberg. Um, Probably there's a massive network of NGOs working inside the United States and elsewhere around the world that are looking to destabilize governments, to overthrow governments, to stage revolutions. And probably Trump administration is one of the main targets, if not the main target. And if you study very closely how the Bolshevik Revolution happened in 1917, that's how it happened. It was, and also the overthrow of Ukraine's government in 2014. That's how it happened. They infiltrate the system with literally hundreds of non-government organizations. They work through charities, because then these charities give money to these radical organizations.
The broader point here is about concerns over foreign funding and its potential influence on domestic political movements. Large financial transfers, if confirmed, would understandably raise questions about transparency and accountability. Around the world, governments monitor NGOs to ensure they are not being used to manipulate political outcomes. Historical examples show how external actors can exploit civil society networks during periods of instability. This is why oversight and clear legal frameworks are essential for democratic resilience. Regardless of the specific case, maintaining trust in public institutions requires visibility into how organizations are funded and what purposes they serve.